Okay, let's just dive right into this. It's got to be one of the most seductive claims out there right now. This idea that psychedelics can just unlock human creativity. I mean, we've all heard the stories, right? You've got the Silicon Valley microdosers, breakthrough painters, iconic musicians, even these massive tech titans saying that these molecules basically open doors in their minds that literally nothing else could. It's a hugely powerful cultural myth. But you kind of have to wonder, is there actually a magic chemical switch for creativity? Or are we just looking at a highly romanticized legend? Well, that is exactly the core mystery we are unpacking in today's explainer. Psychedelics and creativity, what the science really says. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to separate that captivating cultural legend from rigorous modern neuroscience. We're going to look really closely at what actually happens to the creative brain when it's under the influence of these compounds. We're stripping away all the hype, ignoring the wild anecdotes for a minute, and we're just going to rely purely on the science to see what the data actually tells us. Now, the link between psychedelics and creativity, it isn't just some fringe idea. It's really the founding myth of the entire psychedelic field. When you've got historical giants like Francis Crick envisioning the double helix, or, Steve Jobs famously calling his experience with LSD one of the absolute most important things he ever did, well, that sets a pretty massive expectation for the rest of us, doesn't it? The fairy tale's super inspiring. But as curious learners, we really want to know what actually happens to the creative mind when we measure it carefully in a totally controlled setting. Okay, let's take a quick look at the timeline here to see how this all builds. We really have to start our journal back in 1966. There was this famous, though, full disclosure, uncontrolled experiment that essentially planted the seed for the whole modern microdosing trend. From those early days, we jump into the 2010s, right when microdosing became this massive cultural phenomenon. And that leads us straight into the modern era, where researchers finally started pushing back with strict, double-blind placebo trials. And honestly, this progression from wild open experimentation to strict scientific rigor, that is exactly where the real story lives. So let's jump back to that first big moment, 1966, Menlo Park. Researchers Willis Harman and James Fadiman ran a pilot experiment that is, well, it's legendary at this point. They brought in 27 professionals. We're talking engineers, architects, mathematicians, people whose entire daily jobs relied heavily on intense problem solving. And here's the kicker. Each of these professionals brought in a real unsolved work problem that they had literally been stuck on for weeks, sometimes even months. They were given a dose of mescaline and just spent the day working on their specific puzzles in a super supportive setting. And the results? They were absolutely jaw-dropping. Participants reported dramatically reduced inhibition and anxiety. They could suddenly see their problems in a much wider context. They had richer visual imagery, a freer flow of ideas. And actually, several of them genuinely solved the real-world puzzles they'd been wrestling with for months, which sounds amazing, right? But, and this is a massive but, we have to add a crucial scientific caveat here. By modern standards, this study was completely uncontrolled. There was zero placebo, the volunteers were highly motivated, and honestly, their expectations were just sky high. So it showed us what might be possible, but it definitely couldn't prove the drug actually caused the breakthroughs. To really figure out what was happening, modern neuroscience had to take this giant, broad concept of creativity and break it down into measurable parts. So let's pivot to how creativity science actually works today. The first key concept you need to know is divergent thinking. Think of this as pure idea generation. It's your brain's ability to produce just a ton of varied and original possibilities. The classic psychology test for this is asking someone to list every single possible use for a brick. You want a wild, generative fountain of options, no matter how weird or wacky they sound. This is the brainstorming, expansive phase of the creative mind. But as you probably know, just generating wild ideas isn't enough on its own. And that brings us to our second concept, convergent thinking. This is all about idea selection. It's that process of zeroing in on the single, correct, or absolute best answer. Think of it kind of like solving a complex logic puzzle, where there is only one right solution. The thing is, true creativity actually requires both of these gears to turn seamlessly together. You need that wild fountain of divergent options followed immediately by the sharp, disciplined discernment of convergent thinking to actually pick the right one. So when people say psychedelics boost creativity, scientists really have to ask, wait, which kind? When we look at the recent double-blind, placebo-controlled microdosing studies, a pretty stark comparison emerges. For divergent thinking, researchers do actually see a small, modest lift in originality. People generate somewhat more novel and less obvious ideas. But on the flip side, for convergent thinking, there is no reliable help at all. In fact, focused answer finding can actually dip acutely. So essentially, psychedelics give a subtle boost to the wild, generative side of your brain, but they don't help, and can actually kind of hinder, the disciplined answer-finding side.
Which brings up a really fascinating question for us to ponder. Why exactly does a looser brain generate wilder ideas? What is physically happening inside your skull to make you more likely to come up with 20 weird uses for a brick, but suddenly totally unequipped to solve a basic math equation? To understand this, we have to shift our focus from the psychological effects and look at the actual biological mechanisms at play.
Okay, so here is the biological chain reaction. Step 1. The psychedelic molecule activates the 5-HT2A receptor in the brain. Step 2. This activation quiets down what's called the default mode network. You can think of the default mode network as basically your brain's rigid everyday control center. Step 3. This leads to what researcher Robin Carhart Harris famously calls the entropic brain. Essentially, your brain's normal, rigid hierarchies get loosened up. It becomes a bit more disordered, more flexible, and this allows regions of your brain that normally never talk to each other to suddenly start communicating. Your brain starts reaching for much more distant, unusual associations. It can really be summed up like this. The drug widens the search, it does not sharpen the aim. It's totally a double-edged sword. A mind that takes its usual, everyday filters a little less seriously is naturally going to throw off novel, surprising combinations. You get this amazing rush of raw, unedited material. But because those analytical filters are lowered, it becomes so much harder to lock onto a single correct answer. You have way more dots, but ironically less ability to connect them into a straight, logical line. Okay, let's dive into this next part, because it is literally the massive plot twist that keeps honest researchers incredibly humble. We absolutely have to talk about the placebo elephant in the room. When modern scientists finally tested microdosing using strict self-blinding studies, which means people genuinely do not know if they took a real dose or a fake placebo one, the results completely flipped the script on that whole Silicon Valley legend. Get this, in these careful self-blinding studies, an enormous share of the everyday creativity boost reported by users, it actually shows up in people who only believe they took the drug. Placebo microdosers reported many of the exact same improvements as the people taking the real thing. Now, while there is a small, genuine pharmacological drug effect on top of it, this data reveals that expectation is doing a massive amount of the heavy lifting here. Your belief about what the molecule will do is largely driving the results. Now, I want to be super clear about this. This isn't a scam or fraud. It is the genuine, astonishing power of expectancy, or what scientists call set and mindset. The sheer ritual of microdosing, the clear intention you set for your day, and just the deeply held belief that you are suddenly a more creative person, all of these profoundly shift how you think and feel about your own creative output. You essentially grant yourself permission to be creative. It's a very real psychological effect, but, it's a completely different claim from saying the molecule itself magically made me creative. So, bringing this all together, synthesizing everything we've looked at today in this explainer, here is the fair, scientifically grounded verdict. Real sparks, but absolutely no magic switch. Psychedelics can, under the right conditions, lower the internal fear and inhibition that typically block our ideas. They really can surface unexpected associations and hand you a wealth of novel raw material. But they don't reliably improve focused problem solving, and they absolutely cannot replace craft, expertise, and discipline. I absolutely love this quote from the source material because I think it grounds this entire explainer perfectly. The molecule can widen the canvas. It cannot paint the painting. The psychedelic might open up a wider space of possibility, right? It might temporarily quiet that harsh inner critic standing guard at the door. But the actual act of creating, the grueling, beautiful discipline of taking that wild possibility and turning it into a finished, polished piece of work, that is entirely up to you. And that leads us to one final, deeply provocative thought that I want to leave you with today. We just saw how the placebo effect, meaning simple expectation and intention, can produce these remarkable surges in perceived creativity. So, if your own belief alone can unlock so much creative potential inside of you, without a single active molecule, what other doors is your mind just waiting to open? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.